Kaitlyn, for asking me to make this talk. Patient involvement in research is something that I have become extremely passionate about over the last maybe 4 or 5 years, but it has its origins way back when I first was diagnosed with MS nearly 30 years ago. But in this talk, I'm going to go through a couple of things that hopefully will give you a little bit of light about my journey, what I have done, and what I hope will happen for the future. So I will tell you about how it started, my first tries at advocacy and how it failed, my car accident and how that led me into where I am now, my engagement in social media, blogging, then research in the university in Galway, and then my other advocacy roles that have materialized since then, and my thoughts for the future. So to begin with, how did it all start? Well, just to give you an idea, I have multiple sclerosis, and I was diagnosed with this nearly 30 years ago now when I was in London. I had just finished my degree in Galway, a Bachelor of Commerce degree, and I was training to be a chartered accountant. And in October of that first year, I came back to Ireland for my graduation. And this was going to be a great time, and I was going to be absolutely delighted. And when I got off the plane in Galway after being in London, my heels felt a bit numb. And it was an odd sensation. I actually put it down to the dampness in Connemara. It is part of where I live. It seems to be always wet. But it kind of went away after I returned back to London, and I didn't pay much heed to it, but it returned again, and it was a little bit further up my legs. And I got a little bit concerned about it, and I went to my doctor. She said to me, just keep an eye on it. If things change, come back. And those symptoms went, and they came back again. And she referred me to a neurologist in Queen's Square in London. And it's there that I did a number of tests. And on my birthday, which was the following January, I had my appointment with the neurologist, and he sat me down and he said, looking at all the stuff, I had oligoclonal banding in my CSF, I had different responses for my, I think it was EKGs, and my symptoms were relapsing and remitting. So they were coming and going. And he said on the balance, he felt that I had multiple sclerosis. And I had never heard of this illness before. I did know what it meant. And he didn't really give me that much information at that time. And then I asked him, what can I do? Is there anything that I could do to change this? And he said, actually, there's nothing you can do. You just keep on doing what you're doing. And that was a kind of a tough thing to hear. And I went home that evening after that meeting, and I had an encyclopedia in the days before Google. And I opened it up, and the impression that I got of MS was something that I really did not want to have. And it was, I sunk. Now, one of the things that I did at that stage is I went to the local MS society, and they invited me to a tea and coffee afternoon in a hall near where I was living in London. And I arrived to that place, and when I walked in the door, it was like a basketball pitch and a basketball court, and around the edge there was all people in wheelchairs, in these almost like beds. They were very disabled people, and they were old and crippled. And I looked at them and I just thought, oh my God, is this going to be me? And that actually was really, really tough. And it was an awful shock to my system. Here I was, young, 23 years old, and I was seeing this as this is going to be my future. And in a way, I just at that stage blocked it out. And I tried to continue my career in London. And I lasted 18 months. Over those 18 months, my symptoms came and went. My mobility got worse. I found it very difficult to walk to work, to get to the tube, to the underground. Cold was a huge impact. I'd wake up in the morning, well able to walk, and I'd be out the door 100 yards up the road and my right leg stopped working. And I was literally dragging it on the way to get to the train station. This caused me back pain, all sorts of issues, but I told them at my work and they were fantastic to me. This is 30 years ago now. They altered the way I worked. I could be based in the office. If I had clients, they would make sure that they were going to be close to where I live so that I didn't have to do that same level of physical activity that an average person can do. And they also allowed me to come into work late, leave early if I needed to. They were extremely accommodating. However, after 18 months, I felt I just could not do this anymore. It was too difficult to combine study, work, trying to keep my illness in control. And so I jumped ship. I left and I came back to Ireland, to the bosom of my family and the warmth of my mother and father, trying to make my life a little bit easier. And I had an absolute crisis when I got home. My parents really looked after me, but I remember one day I was in my room and sitting on the bed and my mother came up to me and she said, "Robert, how are you doing?" And I literally broke down in tears. Everything was so bleak. I did not know how I was going to continue. How is my life going to move on to the next stage? And I suppose that was a low point. And from there, I started to climb. And I was very lucky that the family, we had a priest friend of ours, Father Michael Kane, and he pulled me aside one day and he brought me into a separate room and sat me down and he said, "Robert, we all have difficulties in our lives. We all have stresses and strains." And he said he had challenges in his life that made his life difficult. And he said, there is a way that you can learn to live with this, to learn to live with something that is a real big challenge like an illness. And it was focusing on the moment, just taking this moment that you're living in and to live it to its fullest. He said the past has happened and there is nothing you can do about it. No matter how much you think about it, no matter how much you plan, you're not going to change it. So there's no point in dwelling on the past. And the future is unknown. And he said, that's obvious to you, Robert, because you never expected to get this illness. So you don't know what's going to be around the corner. And to focus your life completely on the future, that also leads you to trouble. So focus on the moment. And I really took that to heart. And I decided to just live in the moment, do the best that I could at that moment in time. So I adapted and changed. And a couple of things happened. I met somebody, I started a new business, I got married, I had children, all while having relapsing remitting MS. And I was able to actually write a prospectus for an IPO in the United States, reporting to the SEC. And that was, for a young man with MS, was incredible. I was having a normal life. I was like everybody else, but I did have the challenges of the illness. After a period of a few years, I was put on a drug called beta interferon, manufactured by Avonex, and its role was to help reduce the amount of symptoms. And it was kind of working for me, but I heard about another drug in the United States that I thought would be far more effective. So I stopped all the medications that I was on and started this new medication, which was called low dose naltrexone. And I was on it for about 6 weeks and my fatigue issues went, my mobility problems went, my sensory problems went, everything disappeared. And it was just like a miracle. I could do stuff that I couldn't do before, and I was delighted with it. So I actually, at that point, started to share my story. I was on the radio. I was in the newspapers sharing it. I gave talks to people about it. And then at one stage I decided maybe I could do more, because this drug was an off-label prescription. It was not designed for people with MS. And I felt that we really needed to do a clinical trial to show its efficacy. So I spoke to the Minister for Health of Ireland, and I said to her, you could use this medication. Now, the medication I was on before was costing the state €1,500 per month. And the drug that I was talking about cost €10 per month, right? A completely different scale of cost. And I presented it to her. I said, you should really try and do this. You should try to do a clinical trial. Crickets, nothing. I heard nothing back from them. There was no reaction. Now I realize 30 years later, 15 or so years later, that I used the wrong approach. There is a whole other way that research works, that medicines work, and I just did not know the language. I did not know the framework that it worked in. I was approaching it from a completely different perspective. Anyway, I went quiet for a long period of time. I was 10 years symptom-free. And then I had an accident back in 2014, car accident, and it was a very small accident, actually really low speed. But whatever happened, I had a whiplash injury. And as a result of that, I have what they call persistent post-traumatic headaches. So I'm in constant pain with headaches. And I have to be very careful how I manage my day and my week in order not to put too much pressure on my head so that those headaches don't get worse. But I did notice after 2 days after the accident, my MS symptoms started to come back. And my walking, I felt my leg a little bit heavier. And the headaches had also impacts on me in that they had an impact on my cognition. They had an impact on my ability to control my emotions, my ability to interact with other people, to handle situations where there was more than one other person. And this was really difficult for me at that point. I was going through a transition to my life. I had separated from my wife, who's now ex-wife, and there was a lot of going on. My mother was terminally ill with breast cancer. There was a lot of things going on. And I went through a kind of a regroup phase, and I was getting balanced again after that. I met somebody new. I had love back in my life. Things were shaping up. My mother had passed away, and we transitioned after that. And my new partner said to me one day, Robert, you really should let people know about your journey. You should tell them your story, because she felt that I was doing things that maybe other people should know about. So I decided to write a blog. And that was the start of this next adventure that has put me on this patient advocacy path. That blog really, for me at that time, was more like a therapy. I got to share my aches and pains and my tribulations and my worries and my concerns, but also my successes, the things that I did to make life a little bit better for myself, the tools that I had learnt in my life as a business consultant, as starting businesses, operating systems, and I was able to take what I had learned from that and put it into my life and make my life something that was livable with multiple sclerosis. And on top of that, I have asthma, I have sarcoidosis, and this chronic pain. I also, as part of that, blogging, got involved with Facebook and Twitter. And I ended up connecting with the MS Society again after a long period of time not being part of it. And they asked me to be one of the bloggers on their MS and Me blog. And that reconnected me with my community. And I was hearing now stories from them about what was happening in their lives, what were their problems. And we were able to share our experiences. And I worked with a group in the United States, MS Pals, Shift MS in the UK, which is now an international organization. I was part of a community of people with MS. And as part of this, I was on the newsletter for the MS Society, and they had a research newsletter, and in it there was a job for a research assistant for a trial that was happening in the local university in Galway. I thought, God, this is it. This is for me. This is about MS. It was a trial, and it's ongoing, this trial. It's a new cognitive therapy for people with multiple sclerosis, and it's occupational therapy based. I applied, I got the job as a research assistant, and my role in this was to be the voice of people with MS. And I was the first person employed in this trial. And I was the first person in the university in Galway to be employed as a research assistant who had the illness and whose role was the type of role that I was going to perform. The first one. And so there was a lot of infrastructural problems. There was troubles with accommodation. There was troubles with different things. But I thought that this is my role. I am there to highlight, well, you're making this mistake. You're doing this thing wrong. If you correct this, it's going to make it easier. We had problems with mobility scooters and, toilets and offices. And we've solved some of those problems. COVID solved others of those problems, and which is really quite interesting. But in my first day, or the second day at work, the principal investigator on the trial said, Robert, could you write a patient information leaflet for the trial? I'd never done something like this before. Never. I didn't even know what it was. And so I asked for the information and what I needed to do to write it and what it needed to look like. And I wrote my version of it, and the PhD on the trial wrote their version. And we did a SWOT, a study within a trial, something that I'd never heard of before. And we were studying to see whether there's a difference on the retention of patients in the trial because of the information leaflet. That research is out, and that we actually have reported on that, and that's I can't remember what journal we've published it in, but that is available for people to read. But within that trial, there was a number of things that I've done, which, and God, the time is flying by here. There's a number of things that we've done in the trial that have changed dramatically as a result of having a patient involved from the very beginning. An example is one day the principal investigator came to the meeting along with the postdoc on the trial, and they put down the manual for the participants in the trial, and they put it on the table. Everybody had a look at it. A lovely shiny cover. It looked really nice. And I said, is this for the participants in the trial? And they said, yes. I said, well, it's not suitable. This won't work for them. You need to do something completely different. And they were actually shocked. There was 4 other people in the room, and they just, what do you mean? It's just a book. It's, that's what we always do. This is how the book looks. And I said, but if you have hands like mine, if you have MS like me, that book does not work. I need a book that lies flat on the table. I don't need a book that I have to hold open because it's got a particular binding and it's struggling, because my hands don't work as well as yours do. I said the paper on it is shiny, and I can't sense shiny paper. I need rougher paper. I need a cheaper paper so that I can actually grab the page. I need it to be bigger. I need to have the numbers in a different way. I need to have the fonts and the colors in a different way, because that's what I need for my illness. So we had a good discussion about it, and I relished that, because it meant that they challenged what I felt, and that they got a deeper understanding of the reason why this needed to happen. We brought that to the patient advisory panel, and they 100% agreed with my assessment. And then they also added a few extra things, like an extra pouch at the back of the manual for loose pages. This is patient involvement in the middle of the research. And it's so interesting, because as a result of that, We have saved money because the materials are suitable for the patients. We've saved time because it was caught early on in the process. We didn't actually have to reconfigure things at a later stage. But the intangible element of it was that we created a better impression for the participants in the trial. I have finished the post-intervention interviews of the participants, and not a single one had an issue with the format of the book. It was not an obstacle for them. It was invisible to the patients. Whereas if we had used the other book, that would have become an issue for the participants. And the perception in their heads would have been that the researchers did not understand MS. This was not suitable for us. And that suddenly changed how the research team looked at me. I was not anymore a research assistant. They now styled me as an embedded patient researcher. And that's a whole different beast of a researcher, because I'm really advocating for my community. I'm in the middle of it. And I think this is something that research is just getting to grasp with. If you look at the history of patient involvement in research, it really started, and I was saying this to Kaitlyn just before we started, about the Dallas Buyers Club. If you ever watch that movie, it highlights what the AIDS community had to go through and learned on how to advocate for patient rights in research and what they need. It's a very interesting movie, very educational, and it tells you the start of the journey of patient involvement in research. Since then, I've been involved. Oh, I actually was involved in recruitment in that trial as well. We were recruiting our participants. We had recruited about 50% of what we needed. And there was a slowdown. It just seemed to stop. We couldn't get any more. And we were discussing what could we do. And I said to the team, I said, don't worry, I'll get the rest. I'll figure it out. And I said, okay, what are you going to do? And I went down to the local newspaper and I said to them, I want an article in the newspaper about our trial and you can interview me as part of it. Bang, they took it like a shot and they interviewed me. And there was a 2-page spread in the newspaper for the Connacht Tribune and the City Tribune, which is in my region of Ireland. That led to newspaper articles in the national newspapers and other newspapers around the country. I was on local radio as well as national radio about the trial. And we were able to focus our effort on areas of the country that we weren't getting enough participants from and concentrate on those using the story of the patient. It was somebody who was living with the illness that was recruiting for the trial. And we got the rest. They all arrived in. And it was, we actually had too much in a way for what we wanted, because this is a feasibility trial, hopefully leading onto a bigger trial once it's completed and it's successful. And I hope it really is. One of the interesting things about, because I did that, was when I was doing the post-intervention interviews, the participants knew me. Now, I also write the newsletter for the trial as well. So they're familiar with me. They know I have multiple sclerosis. They know I'm one of them. And I had arranged an interview with one of those participants and I rang her up on the day and she said, oh, Robert, I just can't do this. Can we postpone it for another day? I said, no problem. That's grand. We can do it the next day. And we arranged another day. And the second time I phoned her up, no problem, we did the thing. But she said to me, Robert, you know, if I didn't know you had MS, I would not have been able to tell you that I needed to do it on a different day. I would have felt obliged to do the interview. And it would have been a yes, no, no depth type interview just to get it over with because she was in such fatigue. And the depth of information that she was able to give me, because she felt And each one of the other participants that I've contacted, they know I know what they're talking about. I understand the symptoms. And as a result, the information that we got from those post-intervention interviews is far richer, far fuller of color than they would have been if it was somebody who had no understanding of the illness. And I know researchers might know the ins and outs of the disease, but they don't know what it's like to live with it. They don't know what it's like to walk in the shoes of somebody with MS, or to touch things with hands of MS, or experience fatigue. So since then, I decided I would improve my training. So I did training with UPATI to be a fellow of the UPATI system, and they taught me all about the research process from the very beginning to the very end, how complicated it is, all the stages. And I had all that learned before COVID happened, and I was able to watch how that research was happening and understand the process that it goes through, and even understand how they could make it a little bit quicker. So it wasn't really a shock to me. And I think that's really important, that we as patients know the process, but it needs to be taught to us in a way that we can understand. Now, I'm the type of person that just likes to get involved. And so I was involved with the MS Society. I was involved with the University in Galway. And I attended many conferences and meetings about MS or about research. And I've ended up being involved in several other projects in varying different points in the projects. So, for example, I've been involved with Paradigm, which is a program where they're looking to set up a set of guidelines on how to have patients involved with research from the very beginning. So when you're originally coming up with your research question, that's my medication alert, so I'll have to take that after. With the Paradigm, they were looking to come up with a set of guidelines on how to incorporate patients from when you develop the research question through to applying for the grants, and then actually conducting the research, and then the dissemination. And I was involved with the work package to do with how to make it sustainable, that process. And I thought that was very interesting because it took a little bit from my business background and also from my patient background. As a result, I've been involved with Gravitate Health, which is a project on how to make medicines more understandable to the public. PharmaLedger, I gave a talk on that this morning about that project, where we're putting together an electronic patient information leaflet for all the medicines that you get, so that it'll be on your phone rather than this big sheet of paper. So environmentally it's good, but also it can help in other respects with hopefully people adhering to their medicines a bit better, reporting of adverse effects. There's a lot of positives that can come from that. I was also at a hackathon that was done by Roche, and they brought together patients from various different areas to let them know what we as patients want to get solved to make our lives, to improve our qualities of life. And that hackathon was extremely interesting. The project that I was involved came in second place, but there was one project that did much better. But when they went to develop that project into an app, they invited me to be part of the team that was creating this app. And we were starting from first principles again. And I was questioned not only by the team, but by the programmers and the developers of the app before a single line of code was written. And this, afterwards, we're asking them, did this make any difference to how they developed the app? It made a massive difference to them because they knew what the end game was. They knew what the patient needed at the end of the day. And very often when apps and programs are developed, they bring in the patient halfway through the process or 3/4 of the way through the process. And you end up having to make costly, difficult changes, or you just can't do it. You're too far gone. Whereas if you have the patient in at the very beginning and you're listening to their needs from the very beginning, then everything can be designed to incorporate that throughout the process. And this doesn't matter whether it's an app, whether it's research, whether it is deciding what a country should do to improve research and development within the country. And I'm also involved with that, with the Health Service Executive here in Ireland, the HSE. I'm on their research and development program, part of that committee. And this is, if you consider now, back in 2014, when I had my accident, I thought, that's it. I have no more to give. There's nothing more that I can do, because I was stuck in my life of being in business, the corporate world, and I didn't have access to it. But now my life has completely changed. I have a focus in my life where I'm using my illness, multiple sclerosis, to my advantage. And not only to my advantage, but to the advantage of all other people out there who have chronic illnesses, be it multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's, cancer. Everybody can benefit from patients being involved throughout the research process. So where do I see myself going now in the future? Well, one thing that, and I was at a meeting this morning where we were talking to the Medical Council of Ireland, who are the organisation that decides the guidelines for training of doctors within Ireland. And they want to include more patients in the education of healthcare professionals, not just a small touch point, but actually a continuous involvement of patients throughout the education process. And I think this is going to be very important for healthcare in the future, because healthcare is becoming not siloed anymore, but it is incorporating different disciplines. And having each discipline understand the complexity of somebody living with an illness makes them realize that I got multiple sclerosis. It's seen as a neurological condition, but it's not just neurological. It involves occupational therapists, physiotherapists. It involves dietitians. It involves psychologists, as well as I need to see ear, nose, and throat guys. I need to see, urinary guys. There's so many different disciplines that feed into one illness. So it has to be seen as a whole. But if the students don't realize that there is a person, a human, that has this illness, and they have other needs, it could be to do with their relationships. It could be to do with their work. It could be to do with finding that role of vitality within their lives. That might be lost. And getting that back can actually aid in the recovery or the improvement of the quality of life of the patient. Because I know myself, I'm in pain all the time. It does not stop. But if I can use that pain for something positive, if I can use it for something creative, isn't that a wonderful place to be? Other things that I'd like to see improved is how the social welfare system deals with people who have disabilities or who have chronic illnesses like multiple sclerosis. I'd like to see patients like me who are involved in research to be paid properly for the experience and knowledge that we have. That is a big weakness in the system. And what is really interesting, in Ireland, we have the Health Research Board, and they, coincidentally, as part of the COB-MS trial that I'm on, the cognitive therapy trial that we're doing in Galway, we decided to write an open letter to the Health Research Board's publication. And they published it, and it has been peer reviewed, and I've got my 3 ticks, so I've got my 3 peer reviews, so I'm absolutely delighted with that. But then they invited me to do a blog post about my experience, and they have loved what is written in it, but also its contribution to the story. And they want to actually do a video now and include it in some other of their publications. But one thing that the Health Research Board does here in Ireland is it funds research. And one of the things that it is insistent on is patients should be involved, and they won't fund research that doesn't have patients involved. Their next step in that process, and they just launched it there last week, is creating our future. And they have asked patients to come together and tell them the questions that they want solved. And the Health Research Board will then get those questions, collate them, figure out what questions that can be done, and to get researchers to start solving those problems, the problems that we as patients need solved. And I think that is an incredible step in this whole process of patient and public involvement in research. To the extent even that one of my colleagues on the UPATI training, a fellow called Mark van Grekken, he's a landscape architect in Scotland, but he's Dutch. He's got Parkinson's disease. And he's invited me to be part of the PD Avengers, the Parkinson's Disease Avengers, and they are a group, an international group of people with Parkinson's. And he's asked me to be part of their group because he wants to learn about another neurological illness, what we are doing in our community, and can they do it in their community, and vice versa. And I think that's true collaboration across diseases. And now we want to even see if we can collaborate on getting some research done. And I think that is where the tremendous potential is for the future. That if researchers can get down and dirty with us patients and ask us those questions and delve a little bit deeper into what we need to improve our qualities of life, then we'll have research that's more relevant to really contributing to our general health. So that's a little bit about my patient advocacy journey. I hope it wasn't too long, but it has been incredibly interesting for me. And it's the opportunities that it has given me are, I can't even count really the opportunities that it has given me. And into the future, who knows what can happen. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert. I'll pick from the last sentence that you said. The future is even bigger and brighter if we have more Roberts. The great work that you're doing, I'm sure, has huge ripple effects, and you are an inspiration to many. Like you mentioned, the Parkinson's example, I'm sure other patients do take cue and learn and become activated patients themselves. So we are definitely looking forward to a better world. No, thank you, Robert. It was a wonderful talk. I'll now open the floor to questions. If you want to ask a question, take yourself off mute, come on video if you want, and Robert can answer your questions.
I have something, if that's okay. Sorry, I can't put my camera on at the moment. But first of all, I just want to say, Robert, thank you so much for all the work that you're doing. It's truly inspirational and very, very much inspiring. So I have a clinical background, and only once in my clinical career, one of the doctors said to me, you know what, the patient is actually the true disease expert. And it's really funny that no one else had ever mentioned that in my whole clinical career. Now, obviously, looking at the work that you've done, you've managed to make a huge impact on patient experience, specifically sort of in MS, but also other neurological diseases. So I suppose my question is, how do you think that we can encourage patients to get involved initially in patient advocacy? Because a lot of patients maybe not even know what that means or how to even start getting involved.
It's a two-pronged thing. One is it's responsibility of people like me to tell the story. And I have to let my community know the work that I'm doing in research and the tangible effects that what we do in research can make a difference. And I'm doing that through my blog. I'm doing it through a podcast. I'm doing it through talks like this, whether it is more public side of things rather than this one, which is a bit more of a closed group. That's one aspect, and it's not to be underestimated. We really have to get out there. And I know once we start disseminating the research for the COB-MS trial, that will be the next phase of me trying to get that interest and excitement in the general public in research. But I also think researchers have a responsibility too, and I think governments have a responsibility in this as well. Researchers need to get involved in our communities. If you are interested in MS, join the MS Society, ask to be at some of the meetings so that you can understand what are our needs. It is only by being in the middle of us, and actually there's a poem by Yeats called Circus Animal Desertion, and the last lines of the poem, he says, "I must go where all ladders start to the foul rag and bone shop of the heart." Now, he had lost his muse. He did not know how to write poetry anymore. And he found out, he said, the secret is to get deep down and dirty, go through those raw emotions, be exposed, be vulnerable. And then he found his muse again. And I think that's what researchers need to do too. They need to go and speak to patients. Let us know what you can and cannot do, right? And let us have a dialogue. And then it doesn't become researcher and patient anymore. We're collaborators. We're working together. And I think that's where it will really work together. But we have responsibilities on both sides.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Great. Hi, Robert. My name's Alex. Really interesting to hear your story. My grandfather had MS, and he actually died before I was born. But listening to the way my dad talks about his childhood and kind of caring for his father as a teenager, is kind of really interesting to hear someone else's story and journey, and how yours has been quite different to my grandfather's. So thank you for sharing that. And I think I really enjoy what you've been saying. I guess my question is, we've talked about researchers, about patients. What do you think the role of the pharmaceutical industry is kind of in this environment?
I think the pharmaceutical industry is actually taking heed. It's starting. A lot of it is still not true patient engagement or patient involvement. It's quite cursory. So they develop something and then they have a focus group to ask a few questions. We're not really embedded in the process yet. But this is not a project that happens instantly. It cannot. It has to happen in stages, and that trust has to grow. And when you have an industry that is hundreds, if not thousands of years old, that has not included the patient as part of the process. Remember, the Hippocratic Oath nearly thought that the patient shouldn't be told at all what is happening to them, okay? The original version. Whereas now people are beginning to see that the patient can contribute something to the equation. And this is part of my role, saying this is what we can do. But I also think in the current climate where there's huge distrust of governments, distrust of pharmaceutical industry, and that has come because there was almost like a wall between us, between the patient and these organizations. We want to build that trust back together, and it involves us being more transparent about the process. And that's transparency on both parts. I need to say what my fears, my worries, my concerns are, but the industry needs to say that too. I think this is a long way to go, but my project that I did with Roche on the Remind Me app, I think that shocked them, the benefit of having a patient involved with that project from the very beginning. I was the first person in Ireland to be employed by Roche in a patient advisory role. And it was a breakthrough for them. Like they didn't have contracts, they didn't know how to pay me, they didn't know what rates to do. There was a whole load of stuff. Now, for me, that is just gold, because I get a chance to start developing it from the beginning. You know, it helped to shape the process. But I think it also demonstrated to Roche as a company, certainly in Ireland, the benefit of including patients in the process. And so they have come back to me again and again to help them with other things. Like we're working together now with the Neurological Alliance of Ireland to help increase the amount of MS nurses in Ireland. And they've asked me to help speak about that. That benefits me, but it also benefits them. So we work together. And I think that will open up the doors. And by being involved even in those areas, we're humans. We need to know the other person. We need to figure them out. We need to be able to build that trust. And it's that trust building that has to happen first. And I think this is a soft, easy way of doing it. Not too much risk on behalf of the company. They can see, okay, these are the benefits. This is what we can do. This is how we can incorporate it into our processes. I hope that answers your question. That's
great. Thank you. Yeah. And I kind of, I totally agree with what you're saying. You know, I think that pharmaceutical companies, for all the fact that they're actually producing medication, it's one of the most, compared to all the other companies in the world, it's probably one of the most laudable pursuits, and that there's no trust, and there's this kind of big wall between what everyone thinks. So I totally agree. And I think that also building that trust, I mean, I know that pharmaceutical companies are often very, very scared to engage with patients because of all the regulations that exist. And I think it takes some quite bold individuals to push through their own kind of corporate compliance teams and say, no, we've got to really do this. And to, like you said, we're humans, so you're paving the way from this side, and you need to find some people willing to meet you as well. So yes, thank you, Robert.
You're welcome.
If there are no other questions, Robert, I will want to get your opinion on something. In a lot of disease areas that we work, chronic disease areas, including MS, often and you, I'm sure, are aware of that sometimes from a perspective of researchers or the perspective of pharmaceutical companies, it's like a tick box exercise. They want to include a patient. They want to include patients. What they do not understand is the diversity of the patient profile, and what matters to a 16-year-old diagnosed with MS would be very different from a 40-year-old who has been living with MS for 10 years, let's say. So how do you see in all your work across different stakeholders, do you see that difference, that they are really wanting to engage different kinds of patients when they say the word patients? Are they making the whole effort to make it diverse and representative?
This is the biggest challenge that I think patients and researchers have, is to have real diversity. What I have seen is most of the people like me tend to be white, middle-aged or older, have had some third level education. And that is not a representative group at all. And it is to get to that person who represents the greater volume of people. And how do you do that? That is a huge challenge. And if I go back to what we've done with the COB-MS trial, by me speaking on the radio and in newspapers, we had access to communities that we did not have through the other media that we used, because we used, for example, the MS Society newsletter. Only certain people are going to read that, right? It's a particular group. We used the usual press release routes And that's another type of group. But I was speaking on local radio stations, and that touches the communities much deeper. So when I was speaking in our local radio station, Connemara FM, that has a listenership of maybe 5,000-6,000 people in total. But those people, they may not have been any contact with the MS Society, they may not have any contact with research, but because they heard somebody with MS on their local radio station being interviewed by somebody that they generally know, right, it gives them a level of trust and confidence. And that meant in our trial, we had a much more diverse grouping of people contained within the trial. They weren't all from Dublin. They were from the west of Ireland, Connemara and Donegal and Kerry. They were all around the country, different age groups, young, old, middle-aged, across the economic spectrum. That's what needs to happen. But it's not easy, because you need to have a patient that's willing to tell that story. You need to have a patient that's willing to expose those bits of them that not everybody's quite willing to do. I'm one of those people I have no problem. I have no problem sharing that I might have bladder issues, or I might have, mobility issues or cognitive problems, which can be a real difficulty for some people to admit. I feel it's really important to destigmatize not only my illness, let other people understand what it's about, but also to incorporate people from different diverse communities, because that means that the quality of the research is going to be far better. We're going to have that diverse pool. It's going to make it more challenging for researchers, though, because they don't have like a nice set that is easy to define. So there's challenges on both sides. But one of the things that I started doing was the podcast that I have is actually broadcast on our local radio station, and that accesses the community. So now they're hearing about research every week. They're hearing about, what it's like to be a patient, what our needs are, what our troubles are, but what our successes are too. And that destigmatizes, and suddenly we become part of the vernacular. And I think that's really important. And I think that's where the challenge is for research into the future. But we have to do it step by step.
Sure. No, that was wonderful, Robert. At least I have one example from you now of how the issue of making clinical trials more diverse was tackled. And mass media was probably a good approach there, using the radio channels. So at least I have one example of how that was done. So that's great.
And we actually as part of it, we put some of those interviews up on the internet as well, so that people could hear what it's like. So it's transparent, it's real, it's open.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Robert. The other thing I wanted to check with you is often there are pieces of psychological research that say that patients who become activated and take ownership of the disease and go along doing advocacy for their disease, their quality of life improves because the focus shifts from the disease itself to doing something bigger, better, connecting to a bigger cause. Do you feel you have felt, I'm using too many words, that difference before becoming a patient advocate to after becoming a patient advocate? Do you feel that difference happening?
Oh, there's no doubt about it. It increases vitality. It makes you feel of use. And though I have had my dark days, there have been days when I've been very low, I've been in a darkened room, and I've shed those tears for the me that I lost, the old Robert. And I suppose I had to go through that grieving process, and it is cathartic in a way, in that when you shed yourself of that old you and you embrace the new version of you. And I think it's one of the things that happens with anybody with a chronic illness is the rules change. When you're well, there's a certain rule set and you've been brought up in it. You've been educated throughout your life by your family and school and your community. And then you get a chronic illness and the rules change. And you have to live your life in a completely different way, and how to get that symbiotic relationship between you and your illness. And I think being an advocate has given me the freedom to really have that true symbiotic relationship where I accept the rules of my illness. I live within those rules, and that allows me, and my effective working week is 10 hours. I cannot do any more than that. That is my limit. So I have to utilize those 10 hours as best I can and to get the most impact I can out of those 10 hours. I think I'm making good headway on that. It's going pretty well. For me, it needs that diversity. I do a bit of stuff with governmental, I do some with pharmaceutical, I do the research bit, but also connecting with my community is so important. And even on Thursday, I'm doing a webinar with the MS Society that I'm hosting, where I'm interviewing Dr. Jonathan Egan, discussing how you can get that vitality back in your life when living with a progressive illness like multiple sclerosis, right? And I can use my life as an example. And in those webinars, that is what makes them really valuable to patients, is that it's not just a healthcare professional saying their stuff. It's actually somebody with the illness questioning, and they say, but for me, it doesn't work that way, or it feels different, or, I need something different to what you're talking about, or I just don't understand the words that you're saying, right? And I think that is, for me, has given me great personal fulfillment, that I can use something that can be seen, and it definitely is a negative, in a positive way. And it's that turnaround that can make the difference. And okay, my mobility is getting worse. My bladder problems are getting worse, and my cognition is suffering more as time progresses. But that's all being done in the context of, well, can I use this to benefit my community? And that makes it so much more palatable.
What a blessing to have your time out of the 10 hours. It's an absolute privilege to have a slice of that 10 hours that you dedicate to your week. Any other questions? Kaitlyn, you did a training on health education, health literacy for patients who are low on literacy. Do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, it was interesting actually, Robert. We were talking about that before, weren't we? But just to sort of connect with kind of what you said about reaching a more diverse set of people, I think, like you said as well, a lot of people who become patient experts and advocates do tend to sit in the more educated section of society. And I do think it's really important to be able to reach out to people either via different channels, as you said, but also just making that kind of information and learning a lot more accessible to the wider community, especially because not necessarily with, for example, genetic diseases or anything, but there is health inequality because of the way that people live their lives for people who have low health literacy, lower economic status. So they are actually an underserved proportion of our population health-wise anyway. So I think there's a lot that can be done to help to narrow that gap by making that information a lot more accessible and trying to reach them through the channels where they are, as you said. So I think that's a really good example of how we can apply that to sort of the wider community, not just related to a specific disease. So yeah, that's just was fantastic to hear from you.
And I actually think that is one of the things that we end up being bridges between researcher and the public, that we have to translate the language of the researcher and put it into a language that the patient can understand and that is relevant to them, that solves the problem that they have. And I think that translation has to be done in a particular way. It needs particular voices that can do it. Not everybody can do that type of thing. But it's really critical that you have somebody who has a foot in both camps and that can act as that bridge. And that helps to bring us a little bit closer together. And the more we have, it's almost like a zipper. You know, we'll eventually get together and we'll be just one, you know, fabric. And that's the hope. And accessing those communities, using the right language, like even here in Ireland, we have different accents, we have different vernaculars for things. And to incorporate that diversity needs people from those communities. And that's one of the roles that I see for myself, is to try and get more people involved. And that's using things like TikTok and Facebook and Twitter and those channels that people are using. But we also can't forget those who are not into technology. And that's where the newspapers and the radio stations come in, because those are the lifelines for that part of the community. So there's a lot of work that has to be done. I know researchers are looking for people, but it's to get that diversity of people. And I think that's a process. It just takes time for that to happen, and we can't expect miracles.
Well, any other questions? Right, looks like there are no more questions. Robert, it's been an absolute privilege to hear from you, to learn about your journey and your great work. So we'll be in touch offline after this call. We would love to work with you. Maybe, well, I don't think we are in a situation to promote your work. You're in itself quite a great example of what you've been doing. But if there are any ways we can help you kind of make this voice bigger and reach out to more patients, that's the ambition, and we'll stay in touch for that. Thank you so much, Robert.
Absolutely. It's been my pleasure to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Robert.